Finding Christians around the world, you would easily find that those Christians are either evangelicals or Roman Catholics. And so these are the two main constituencies of global Christianity that you can find everywhere you go around the globe. So any global Christian of the beginning of the third millennium needs at least to grasp what is at stake with Catholicism, because everywhere you go, from north to south, from east to west, you will be dealing with the reality of Catholicism. Not only, of course, in the West, but also in the global South, in the emerging countries, in the places where the church is persecuted, places where the church has long established historical roots. Wherever you go, wherever you turn, you will find that the majority Christians are either of the evangelical tradition, so to speak, broadly defined, or the Roman Catholic tradition. They belong to the Roman Catholic tradition. And statistically speaking, these are the two constituencies that are actually growing in the global world at different lengths and with different figures, but these are the two main bodies which are actually growing in terms of statistical numbers. Other Christian traditions are declining very significantly or are basically stuck. The liberal traditions are declining in numbers and importance. The Eastern Orthodox traditions are basically stuck. They are not growing nor declining, they're basically stable. But the evangelical constituency and the Catholic constituency are both at different levels, in different measures, they're both growing. And so it shows that both camps have at least a kind of vitality inherent to their present day expression that attracts attention. And so even from the merely statistical point of view, we have the responsibility to come to terms to what is at stake with Roman Catholicism. Then I want also to add another reason why it is important for us to address the topic of Catholicism, because unlike previous decades and previous generations, what is happening today, what has been happening over the last 25, 30 years onwards, is a growing popularity of Catholic figures, Catholic leaders, not only among Catholics, but especially among evangelicals. And nowadays, a character, a figure like Pope Francis is one of the most respected figures even in evangelical circles. And what happens in the Catholic Church attracts a growing interest even in evangelical Protestant circles. And so there is a need not only to be attracted emotionally or from the media point of view or from the more superficial point of view, there is a need to address why is it that these recent popes, John Paul II, we are in Poland, and we are not far from places that were very dear and close to John Paul II before becoming Pope, of course. But John Paul II, Pope Ratzinger, and then Francis, they are senior, important, the highest figures in Roman Catholic Christianity that are also attracting a growing interest in evangelical circles. And so we have to be aware of why this is happening, and we need to become aware of what is happening around the world when these two bodies interact with one another, especially why is it that popes are attracting lots of attention, sometimes lots even of enthusiasm, even in evangelical circles. Pope Francis was nominated Man of the Year a couple of years ago, And so his popularity is not only constrained and confined in evangelical circles, but is also quite a popular character in secular circles, in media circles. And so if we want to understand what is happening in global Christianity, we need to address the issue of Catholicism. These are sociological reasons, these are statistical reasons, these are media or numerical reasons. And as the two bodies interact with one another more and more frequently, there is a lack of evangelical understanding of what is at stake with the global reality of Roman Catholicism. Or at least there is a presumption, an assumption that we know what it is. But what we used to know about it either is no longer applicable to the present day more diverse reality, or it is of a superficial kind of understanding that it doesn't really match the complexity, the challenges, and that Roman Catholicism is bringing to our attention. And so I often find it as amusing, if not discouraging, to find in our evangelical circles very little awareness of Catholic doctrine, very little awareness of Catholic history, and very little awareness of the Catholicity project. That is the global, worldwide, all-embracing outlook and project that the Catholic Church is all about. And so this is a welcome initiative and opportunity for us to reflect together on what is at stake with Roman Catholicism. This is even more importantly so because there are a number of common misunderstandings about what Roman Catholicism is all about. In our evangelical circles, we often approach Catholicism with naivete, with a kind of wrong assumptions or superficial, limited, narrow observations. For instance, we often listen nowadays that Roman Catholicism has changed, and it's a brand new, different reality than it used to be across the centuries. We are facing an entirely new phase in church history, whereby what used to be an entrenched reality of an institutional church, hierarchical church, sacramental church, political church, defined by the Council of Trent, defined by the reaction against the French Revolution and against modernity, is now totally different from what it used to be. And so when people look around themselves, they look that some Catholics are actually, they appear to be as if they were evangelicals. They appear to be speaking, using the same language as evangelicals use. They appear to do things and practices and forms of spirituality that look like what most evangelicals would be familiar with. And so there is a growing sense that the old separations, the old doctrinal dividing issues are no longer applicable to the present day reality, which is much more marked by a growing convergences between believing evangelicals and practicing Catholics of various stripes. Now, there are people who observe the fact that after the Second Vatican Council, so 50 years ago, the Bible in the vernacular languages was allowed to circulate in Catholic circles. That was not the case before the Second Vatican Council. And so the fact that the Bible is now in the hands of the average Roman Catholics is something of a welcomed development, and something that in the mind of some evangelicals is in itself a turning point that has completely changed the picture. We have to be aware, however, that with the Second Vatican Council and after the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church has been experiencing a variety of developments in various directions. Some of them are close to what evangelicals would be familiar with, that is the diffusion of the Bible, within the laity, the emergence of the charismatic Catholic movement within the institutional church, the spreading of forms of evangelical spirituality among especially the lay movements, the lay Catholic movements. These are some developments, some directions that are happening in within the Catholic Church. But we have to be aware that there are other directions that are happening as well, and they run in very different directions than those we have been mentioning so far. After the Second Vatican Council, there's been a strong Marian spiritual movement within the same church. And so next to the recovery of the Bible, we also have had the reemergence, or even the expansion, the development of various kinds of Marian spiritualities. The appearances of Mary in different parts of the world, Poland being one of them, is an example of the fact that if you have the Bible in the hands of the Catholic laity, or even in the hands of the Catholic hierarchy, it doesn't mean that other forms of spirituality which clearly contradict biblical spirituality would decrease. In other words, in the Catholic Church there is no proportionality, no direct proportionality between adding the importance of the Bible, and there is no consequence as far as the possible growth of alien spiritualities at the same time. Or think about the emergence of liberation theologies during the 60s and the 70s, political theologies. And these were also trends, movements, directions that would stem out of the post-Vatican II Catholic Church. Or think about the fact that Vatican II was also the council that basically allowed historical critical methods to be used and employed in Catholic exegesis and Catholic biblical theology. And that is introducing the tenets of liberalism, liberal exegesis, liberal presuppositions into the fabric of Catholic theology, at the same time as opening up the way for the laity to have their Bibles, at the same time in which strong popular movements would develop Marian sensitivities and spiritualities, at the same time that political theologies would impact large sectors of the Catholic Church in certain contexts, at the same time when historical critical methods or liberal theologies or liberal thinking would be finally accepted within the synthesis of the Catholic Church. So if you say that something is changing the Catholic Church for good, in the sense that now there is the possibility to approach the Bible, that's only one facet, one aspect of the reality the present day ongoing reality of the Catholic Church. And we have to be aware of the whole if we want to be fair to the Catholic Church itself. This awareness doesn't stem out of the willingness to be skeptical or to be nasty against the Catholic Church. It is actually because we want to be fair to the complexity of the Church that we have to come to terms with the fact that, together with some interesting developments in the Catholic Church, there are other warring developments, and they do happen at the same time, without one prevailing over the other, but because the system of the Church is made in such a way that every movement, every development, every direction is welcomed, unless it challenges the structure that we will be talking about tomorrow. And so if one movement is basically peaceful, in peaceful terms, with the basic dogmatic institutional structure of the Church, it is a welcome addition to the Catholicity of the Catholic theology, that is, to the universality, to the complexity, to the globality of Roman Catholicism. And so only saying the Bible is now in the hands of the people is observing one fact that needs to be also take into account the fact that there are other trends that are occurring in the Catholic Church. So an evangelical turn is happening, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that now what used to be prohibited is allowed. That is, having a Bible, reading it without feeling guilty or without committing a sin. That is a welcomed addition. But at the same time, this introduction of the Bible to the hands of the people hasn't so far produced a significant evangelical turn of the Church as a whole, of the system as a whole, because the system has also allowed alien, not evangelical or liberal or pagan trajectories to be accepted within the synthesis. And therefore, we have a reality that is not so simple to come to terms with, but we need to be aware of the different facets, the different angles of the complexity of the Catholic Church. Other people, another common evangelical assumption in approaching Catholicism is the following. We evangelicals and Catholics, we share the same creedal basis. We have the same reference to the ancient creeds of the Church. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Creed of the Council of Nicaea, the the Creed of Constantinople, basically framing the Christological and Trinitarian outlook of the Christian faith. We share those, and perhaps we differ on specific items and topics related to soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, and related to ecclesiology, the doctrine of the Church. We share the same creedal basis. We differ on basically two doctrinal loci or topics or doctrines. Now, there is a sense in which this is true, but we have to be aware, again, of the complexity of statements like this one. Why? Because we cannot really separate Christian theology, Christian belief, the Christian faith into slices, into pieces and bits, disconnected bits and pieces. There is a book, a famous book written by Mark Knoll back in the 90s, or back in the early years of 2000. Is the Reformation over? The question that Mark Knoll asked to the general public, especially the evangelical public, is the Reformation over? And according to Mark Knoll, if one reads the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church, almost 2/3 of the contents of the Catechism are easily acceptable by an average evangelical reader, because they affirm basic Christological and Trinitarian beliefs. Only 1/3, according to Mark Knoll, is dodgy, difficult, alien, foreign to an average evangelical reader. But then, that's one point. But then Knoll also argues that after making such a statement, such a big statement, he is also aware of the fact that looking at a deeper level, looking at a deeper significance and meaning of words which are used by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you soon realize that the language may be similar or may be the same, because it comes out the common Christian tradition. Words like Trinity, Christ, the Spirit, Church, words like the Bible, the Word of God, these are used in the Catechism. But if you look at them with more historical awareness and more theological consciousness, you soon realize that very often these words are actually, they carry a meaning that is different from what an average evangelical would use them. In other words, there is the use of the same words, the same language, even addressing these very important foundational doctrines like Christology and the Trinity. But given the fact that wherever Christ is mentioned in the Catechism, there is always the Catholic Church involved in that Christ. There is always the institutional, papal, sacramental, global church involved in that Christ. And there is no distinction. There is no distinction between the two. The two are conflated. The two overlap. You soon realize that when Christ is mentioned, the church is implied. When Christ is mentioned, the power of the church is implied. When Christ is mentioned, the role of the hierarchical church is implied. And so the word Christ coming out of the creedal basis is used and needs to be appreciated. But if you actually exegete what that reference to Christ actually means, you soon realize that it is a Christ that has the face of the church and the face of the Catholic Church. It is a Christ that looks like the Catholic Church in a bodily form. Or when the cross is mentioned in the Catechism, there is always the Eucharist implied. There is always the reenactment of the sacrifice of Christ that is implied there. When the Spirit is mentioned in the Catechism, there is always this idea that the Spirit is so tightly linked to the Church that makes it indefectible, makes it infallible in certain ways and in certain contexts. And so Knoll himself realizes that on face value, 2/3 of the Catechism are basically the re-expression of the ancient, classical, orthodox Christian belief, centered on the Christological confession that Jesus is the Lord and the Trinitarian framework of the biblical message. But going deeper, you realize that these terms, these words, these concepts, they carry their specific semantic baggage, theological semantic baggage, that is specific to the Catholic Church. And therefore, we use the same language, but we have to make sure that we actually refer to the same reality in using the same language. Why is it that if we agree on the basic foundations of the Christian faith, we then significantly and severely disagree on other important aspects of the Christian message? How is it that, given the fact that we all share the same creedal common basis, we then end up in very different directions in terms of our doctrines of salvation and the church and mediation and the afterlife and spirituality and the Bible and tradition and the authority in the church? If we have the same basic creedal basis, why is it that we then end up in differing so vastly in very important doctrinal topics? I don't want to disqualify the fact that we actually refer to the same creedal basis. That's a reality. But I want just to ask, I just want to question the simple face value reality of it by, again, by being fair to the Catechism, to the teaching of the Catholic Church, asking a further question about what is it meant by referring to Christ, the Trinity, the Spirit, the Church, the cross, and so on and so forth. So we have to be aware of these common, rather superficial starting points where people begin to think about Catholicism, saying, oh, an evangelical turn is happening. Yes, but there are other directions that are happening within the same church. And so if an evangelical turn is happening, we would expect that other directions would be in the decrease and would be expelled or would be questioned. But the Catholic Church, while accepting the circulation of the Bible, it also accepts practices and beliefs and spiritualities and developments which are contrary to that Bible. And so we have to actually be aware of what makes it possible to have the Bible and what is contrary to it. To introduce the Bible to the laity, and at the same time pushing, accepting, allowing, encouraging directions which run contrary to the Bible. And then, after affirming the reality of the common adherence to creedal orthodoxy, we have to ask further questions about what is meant by the reference to the ancient creeds and the creedal theology. By asking how is it that then out of that common basis, common orthodoxy, we end up in very different historical, theological, spiritual directions. And one answer to that question is that perhaps there is a superficial level of commonality. But if we go deeper, if we exegete, if we try to understand what is actually meant by these creedal statements, we easily end up in finding out that there is a discrepancy, there is a problem even in the what appears to be the common heritage of the ancient church. Another very common assumption in dealing with Catholicism is to introduce the argument that we are only interested in dealing with single people, single individuals. We are not so concerned with addressing the issue of the church as a church. We are only concerned to deal with individual Catholics. We take them as persons, as individuals. We're not so interested in grasping what stands around them. What is the reality that makes Catholicism what it is? We're only interested in dealing in personal relationships. We're not interested in asking theological questions. We're not interested in asking questions about the system of Rome. And there is, again, it is possible, and it is also in some ways advisable to be aware of the personal element of the individual situation of individual people. And we want actually to develop relationships with individuals and not thinking that the real people are the system they represent, or the real people can be confused with the institution that the Catholic Church represents. But on the other way, because Catholicism is a social institution, is a social faith, there is no such an individual Catholic. This is an oxymoron. This is a contradiction in terms. Catholicism is based on a social understanding of what it means to believe, what it means to live, what it means to profess, what it means to practice. It is inherent to Catholicism to make that connection between what one person, a group of people is, and what is the relationship of that individual, that group of people, to the whole of the institution. You are a Catholic if you are related to the institution. Otherwise, there is no, to be fair to Catholic doctrine, there is not such a thing as an individual Catholic. There is not such a thing as a pick and choose Catholic. Although sociologically, most Catholics nowadays are pick and choose Catholics. They cook their own recipe of Catholicism. They take this and that. But in order to be fair to Catholic teaching, we have to be aware of the fact that although there is a personal element that needs to be valued and appreciated, that personal element is not the end of our relationship. We have to connect that individual to what the history, the theology, the practices, the diversity, the globality of the faith that he or she proclaims to believe. And that is, again, it's out of fairness to Catholicism that we have to stretch our own search, our own understanding, our own approach to the issue. One becomes a Catholic if not because he or she believes, but because he or she is introduced into the institution. One is a Catholic if she or he adheres to the institutional practices of the Church of Rome. One is a Catholic in relationship to his or her acceptance of official Catholic teaching. One is a Catholic if she or he goes and accepts and identifies with the main teachings and practices of the Church. Of course, there are individuals, there are different people, there are a personal element, but we cannot really separate the individual from the institutional. We cannot confuse the two, but neither can we separate the two. We have always to combine these two elements, what the person stands for and what the institution out of which she comes from is all about. these are, pointers to our need to think more thoroughly, more deeply, and even more critically or self-critically when we approach a historical, global, theological, institutional, political reality of the Church of Rome. And instead of approaching it, choosing bits and pieces and being, and then using these entry points, projecting onto them the whole picture, we have to take all these points, but being aware of the fact that there is a puzzle there. There is a jigsaw. There is a bigger picture that we have to be aware of. And the single pieces, they are significant, they make sense if they are related to the bigger picture. Otherwise, single pieces can deceive and can project very limited amounts of knowledge to our inquiry. So as we approach the 5th centenary of the Protestant Reformation next year, 1517, Luther's hanging of the 95 Theses in Wittenberg, Germany. We are approaching 2017, 5 centuries after. And in preparation of that centenary, the main ecumenical bodies, the Church of Rome being one of them, are preparing that celebration, or not celebration, that commemoration. There is nothing to celebrate according to Rome. In thinking about the Reformation, the careful choice of the word is commemoration, not celebration. Celebration gives the idea that you actually rejoice in remembering what happened 5 centuries ago. But according to the Church of Rome, you cannot really rejoice in what happened at the Reformation. You can commemorate, you can nurture your memory, and hopefully overcoming the issues that were central in for the Reformation to begin. And as we approach the 5th centenary of the Reformation, the main ecumenical bodies are preparing this anniversary to wanting to convey the message that the issues that were decisive and central in making the Reformation happen have now basically turned into being items and issues that no longer need to be divisive, but can be reframed, reconstructed in terms of them being different emphases within an appeased and reconciled global body of Christians who no longer argue about those things, but who accept the fact that we agree to differ and we are in peace with that. We both accept one another, and we accept the reality of the Catholic Church with all its baggage, with all its traditions, with all its theology, and the Catholic Church has made provision at Vatican II of partially accepting the fact that outside of its fold there are signs of what the true Church is all about. Only signs, only expressions of what the Church is all about. The fullest expression, the only full expression, is in the Catholic Church, but outside of it there are important, significant signs, aspects of what it means for the Church to be the Church. And so the main driving force towards this commemoration of the Reformation is to come to the 2017 by saying we commemorate what happened 5 centuries ago. We don't really celebrate it. We commemorate. But what is even more important, we now have come to the point of embracing one another, recognizing one another, reconciling with one another. The Protestant side conceding the fact that those issues were at least overstretched, and they, justification by faith alone, Christ alone, Scripture alone, were reactions against rather than positive, constructive elaborations of Christian theology, reappropriating the message of the Bible, and the Catholic Church recognizing that the reaction of the Council of Trent, although it was right, it was a bit formulated in a nasty language that now the Church has learned to use in a more polite way, but never really recanting or renouncing to the tenets of the Council of Trent. And we want then to approach the new, the fifth centenary of the Reformation with this new ecumenical rapprochement, ecumenical unity, recognizing that we can differ on certain things without necessarily being divided by being different. Now, as we approach that, there will be many arguments, documents, events, commemorations, and even at the highest level possible, and we need to understand what is happening, what is all about. We need to revise our own history. We need to understand what is at stake with justification by faith alone, what is at stake with Scripture alone, what is at stake with Christ alone, what was at stake with Trent, what was at stake with Vatican II, and what is at stake about what is happening now. If we don't do the homework of understanding this long historical trajectory, if we don't do the homework of understanding biblically, theologically, what was at stake then and what is at stake now, we will soon and easily be trapped into this ecumenical jargon of a new phase, a new unity, a new era of ecumenical unity, and forgetting what the reformers of the first generation were all concerned about, and basically affirming that they were a bit overstretching their case and presenting it in with very sharp edges. That now we have more knowledge, we have less tension to deal with, and we can recognize that they were actually looking at the same reality from different perspectives, and basically these two perspectives can be reconciled ultimately. It is important then that we should understand that. And tomorrow we will be addressing the very topic of what happened at the Reformation and what happened afterwards and what is happening now from different angles, looking at the topic, this very question, against the background of the different theological methods developed out of Protestantism and out of Catholicism, looking at it from the perspective of what it means for the Church to have gone through a phase of confessionalism with the Council of Trent, and then a phase of updating with Vatican II, what it means for the Church to be the institution it is, what is the vision of this global historical Church for the present and the future of the world, what is involved in the message that the Church is actually sending to the present-day world, what it means for us in terms of mission, in terms of gospel faithfulness. And ultimately, and I end with this section, ultimately we have to address the gospel issue. So it's not only a matter of why it is important and how we are not approaching it correctly, or how we should approach it more thoroughly. Ultimately, it is a gospel issue. It is a matter of being faithful to the revealed message of the Word of God, centered on the person of Jesus and in the gospel. And basically, in addressing the topic from a gospel perspective, we have two basic paradigms, biblical paradigms, that can help us to receive orientation and help. Because the topic that we are discussing, that is differences between Christians and Christian bodies, is not a new topic, is not a modern topic. It actually has been a topic since the beginning of the church. And so in the New Testament itself, we have different ways for the apostles to deal with people whom they would differ from. And so they would frame those differences and those relationships in two basic paradigms, very different paradigms. And we have to make our mind in terms of how to, which of the two paradigms best fits and suits our responsibility to address Roman Catholicism as an institution, as a system. The first paradigm has to do with Philippians 1:15 to 18. There Paul is aware of the fact, you remember that biblical text, Paul is aware of the fact that there are other Christians around him who are actually slandering him, who are out of envy or rivalry, they are actually causing a lot of pain to the apostle. They are poisoning the churches that the apostle Paul has been visiting, and has been receiving help from. They are actually using bad words. They are actually caricaturing Paul. They are actually giving false news, and they are actually sending false messages against Paul with the view of demolishing the apostolic authority of Paul and the apostolic integrity of the person of Paul. Paul is fully aware, and he suffers because of that behavior. So being fully aware of that, not being superficial or naive, but knowing that these people are nasty people, wanting to destroy his reputation, he nonetheless, he is aware of the fact that ultimately they preach Christ with bad motivations, with bad motives, with causing lots of strife and pain to him, but ultimately, because they preach Christ, Paul rejoices and takes joy in even thinking about what they do. They are causing pain, but ultimately, because they preach Christ, he is happy to recognize this. They preach Christ. So the central issue for Paul in assessing what is happening around him is not so much, the differences or the pain that they cause to him. It is about the issue about the content of their preaching. They preach Christ. And if they preach Christ, they can even kill me. But I will be happy and I will rejoice if they do so. They cause a lot of pain to me, but ultimately they preach Christ. Now this is a paradigm. When there are people different from us, when there are people, holding to, different views, different perspectives, different even doctrines, different emphasis, different practices, and some of them may hurt us. But if they preach Christ, we have a reason to rejoice. That's one paradigm. The other paradigm is taken from Galatians 1:6-9. And there is the same Paul dealing with other people surrounding or being even in the church of Galatia, and teaching, preaching, advocating for a message that Paul thinks is another gospel. It looks like the gospel, it is close to the gospel, it resembles the gospel, but ultimately is another gospel, is a false gospel. Now, these are strong words, not ecumenically minded words. No ecumenical leader would ever use nowadays such a language. Actually, to ecumenical ears, this language appears to be arrogant. Who are you, Paul, to say that these people preach a false gospel? And Paul says, even if an angel appears to you, telling you that he brings to you the good news, the gospel, if it doesn't match with the apostolic biblical gospel I have preached to you, let him be cursed. These are very strong words. But these are biblical words, and so we have the responsibility to be aware of the difference, the distinction between what is the gospel and what may look like the gospel, what may contain aspects of the gospel, what may resemble elements of the gospel, but ultimately taking it all together as a whole, it is another gospel. And I think that the issue of Catholicism ultimately impinges on this discernment. Is it the same gospel preached with different emphasis? Then we easily can use the Philippians paradigm. We may not agree, we may be, we would like to say things differently, we disagree strongly on certain things, but ultimately they preach Christ, and it's a matter of rejoicing. Or, all things said, even if there are elements that are close to the gospel, ultimately it is another gospel. And therefore, it is the Galatians paradigm that needs to be used. And so I think that these two biblical paradigms help us to maybe simplify the complex task before us, but they give us guidance, biblical guidance on how to approach such a complex topic. Ultimately, is this the gospel? If the answer is yes, well, there are follow-ups in that direction. If it looks like the gospel, but not quite, it's not quite the biblical gospel, revealed biblical gospel, then it follows a very different response.